Hi, Jenny.
Hi, Laurie.
Are we going to talk about Mars retrograde today?
We are.
Okay,
Would you like to-
so before we dive into that conversation, let's talk about who we are. I am Laurie of AstroLore. You are.
Jenny of hiddenpathastrology.com.
All right, so we both are consulting astrologers. We both also teach. If you are looking for a teacher of astrology or a consultation, please contact us. And also, please subscribe to our channel, like our video, share it, and leave comments. We love comments. Don't
That's
we?
right. Yeah, and Laurie and I have worked on building a brand together. So we are AstroPath, and that's what you'll find us under on
Yes.
YouTube.
That is the combination of astrolore and hidden path. So AstroPath. So yeah, thank you for being here. And now we're going to jump right into this conversation about Mars retrograde. What's the first thing we want to talk about this? This is a really significant retrograde. Mars doesn't go retrograde very often, does it?
It does sort of every couple of years.
Yeah.
It's not as often as Venus or Mercury, which Mercury goes a lot.
Yeah.
But I think right out of the gate, we just want you to know that Mars is going to station retrograde on October 30th. This is happening at 25 degrees of Gemini. And it is not going to station direct until January 12th, and that will be at 8 degrees of Gemini. So if you have planets between 8 and 25 degrees of especially Gemini, but any of the mutable signs, which are Pisces and Virgo and Sagittarius, you may have extra special effects from this Mars retrograde. It's a fairly long period. The retrograde is about 2.5 months, but it's going to be in Gemini for almost 7 months.
Yeah,
so.
That's crazy. I mean, Mars usually just bounces through the signs relatively quickly. And here we are just holding this space in Gemini. So, first off, for all of you, make sure you know where Gemini is in your chart, because that is going to be a place where there's going to be a tremendous amount going on in your life. And you're already feeling it clearly.
Yeah, because probably it's also good to note that Mars went into Gemini on August 20th. So we've already had time. It's already gone over these degrees. So we are definitely being given lots of heads ups in this direction.
Yeah.
And I think there's been a pretty big emphasis on communication for quite some time, at least from my point of view.
Yeah.
But first of all,
I just want to say, when Mars moved into Gemini on August 20th, that's just like Mars just brings energy wherever it moves. It just brings that direct, passionate kind of like we're moving forward. And it moved into Gemini, and that area of your life probably lit up with some curiosity. What can I do new? What can I do different? And moving along, and then it starts slowing down, and we start seeing kind of the things that we need to be paying attention to.
Yeah, that's true. Mars really just does bring a ton of energy. And Gemini is a pretty easily excitable sign. So it kind of brings a lot of, so it can be manifesting as anxiety and things like that. And it also can be, as you said, curiosity and just getting into like, what is something new and getting excited about learning, getting excited about finding out something completely new and sharing that information with somebody else.
Or listening too. You think about Gemini as communication, which is both speaking and listening and reading and all the other ways we gather information. But really pay attention when you know what house this is in. Pay attention to what you're hearing yourself speaking about. Because there's probably been, over these few months, there's probably been some new information coming to light for you.
And that's a good point. Is Gemini is an interesting sign, and it has this real dual nature to it, right? You can see it right in the symbol, the two lines of the lines on top and bottom, and so it really kind of brings up duality. And I think that the more kind of shallow, less positive sides of that, we'll say, are just kind of thinking about us versus them, you versus me, black versus white, and really thinking in terms of two things pitting against each other. And that's not, that's that's sort of a more, I guess, basic way of looking at it. But if you get into the more positive sides of Gemini, now we're developing the intellect. We're examining both sides of an issue. We're thinking about, as you said, not only talking, but listening. And so you can use a more constructive part of Gemini to work with these different concepts.
Right. And it is interesting with Mars slowing down. When it first moved in there, it's like all this information just kind of coming at you. And you feel like you're just like gathering it and moving forward with it. And then as it slows down, I think that's where you have to really move into the space of listening and paying closer attention rather than just allowing it to move you. I think one of the most constructive things for me around Gemini is always the issue of curiosity. Opening your mind and exploring all the different ideas. And in our culture at this point in time, everybody seems to be so pitted in their own corner. I think this is really an important thing to think about, the listening, and without having that assertive Mars right there ready to attack if someone says something you don't agree with.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's a good point. I was thinking we should talk a little bit more about what Mars means just before it goes retrograde, and then we'll talk about what shifts with the retrograde.
Right.
So, I mean, Mars is the planet of action. I mean, in the simplest of terms, a lot of times you'll see Mars as a kind of trigger for other events. Like Mars is the thing that makes it happen right in that moment. And in a really positive light, Mars is your willpower, your drive. It's where you can be assertive and take initiative and stand up for yourself.
Motivation, anything that really entails that moving forward. I always think, you don't get out of bed without Mars in the morning. If all there was Venus, you'd just sleep all day. Mars is what actually pushes you forward, gives you the motivation to get things done. Mars also brings in issues of passion, assertiveness. On the negative side, there's all the connections of Mars to war and aggression and, kind of the ugly side of Mars.
Mars can be sort of the battle axe of the larger structure. So if you think of Saturn as the greater malefic according to ancient astrology, and Mars is the lesser one, Mars is the actual arm that's doing the cutting down. So that, I know it's pretty intense to think of it that way, but it really is tied in with that god of war. For each of us personally, I think it can be tied in with survival. It's that survival instinct of you will fight to survive. And that's, it can provide a lot of resource on that level. But hopefully we're not always just fighting for survival all the time. So that you can work with the more positive parts about having an intent about how you want to move in the world, and like making action that is informed and thoughtful. And that's where we want to go with, especially with Mars and Gemini, and developing self-reliance. I mean, I think Mars ties in with that as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So then we want to think about retrograde. What does retrograde mean? I mean, the outer planets retrograde, that's a whole nother topic. But when we're talking about like Mercury, Venus, Mars, these three specifically, the most personal of the planets, when they are retrograde, it is so personal. It's a very personal thing. And early on in studying astrology, I've been studying astrology for 100 years now. And in early years, everything around retrograde that I was reading was so negative. Mercury goes retrograde and everything goes wrong. And I think in general, the culture has caught up with Mercury, at least, to the fact that there's a positive side to Mercury going retrograde. It has, when my thinking first shifted around the Mercury retrograde, it was such a awakening, such a relief. It's like, oh, there are ways to work with these retrogrades. There are ways to really appreciate the fact that whatever the planet is that's retrograde, that's blasting forward, can stop, and we can rethink about what's been going on, how we're using that energy.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so with Mars has probably been the last one that I've learned to appreciate in its retrograde form. Took me a while with Venus. And yeah, these Mars and Venus retrogrades can be challenging us if we aren't prepared for them, if we don't know what's going on. They can be very challenging because we think we're supposed to continue moving forward in a certain way. And all of a sudden, the energies of the universe are not supporting us in that forward motion. They're supporting us to stop and slow down and think about what the heck we're doing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think you're right. I mean, some of that negativity about retrogrades comes from the fact that we live in a culture that values forward movement, and we're all supposed to be galloping forwards 100 miles an hour on everything we're doing and showing evidence of our success and doing all these things. And the reality is that we need rest. There's a balance. There's a yin and a yang here. You know, there's a balance between these things, and that rest is really important. And Mars in particular, I think, is probably one of the hardest retrogrades to grasp because it represents that action principle, and it represents the idea that we're all supposed to gallop forwards and be in charge and, you know, be the warrior all the time, and the warrior never sleeps. And it's just it's a crock, you know, it's not true. Like, we really need rest. And so these periods really provide us with an opportunity to step back, to take a rest, to pause, to examine more of our inner landscape about what we're doing with these things. And with the action principle in particular, it's super important. I mean, you've got to recharge to be able to take effective action. You need to be rested. You need to be nourished. So this gives you an opportunity to do those things.
And I think that, you know, on a cultural level, it's so important to think about how, that whole principle of drive and masculine kind of energy moving forward, and everyone around us seems to be so angry. And I think that it is so important to just slow that process down, because Mars out of control is warlike behavior, super aggression. You know, it's going to blow everything up. So we have to stop and reconsider, how is this energy being used in our culture? How are we personally using it? And the other thing about Gemini is, the stories we tell ourselves. I think that's so important to think about, where we're holding on to this kind of Mars moving forward anger toward other people. What stories are we telling ourselves? And maybe this retrograde, we can use this retrograde as a time to kind of rewrite those stories.
I like that, Laurie. Yeah. I mean, Gemini really holds that storyteller archetype. It also holds the teacher and the networker archetypes, among some others. And I think those are all good topics to think about. And also, in the simplest possible terms, like how you communicate. Is your communication aggressive? Is it, have you studied nonviolent communication? Do you know what the difference is? Understanding how you communicate in your relationships. I mean, geez, there really couldn't be a whole lot more important than that. I mean, if you don't have good communication in relationships, even the best relationships will dissolve if you cannot communicate. So I think there's a lot about that as well. You know, into this, it's those two themes of how you take action, in particular, how you speak. And how you listen.
And another thing I think I want to just mention here, Mars rules Aries and Scorpio. And I think for those of you that are listening, you know, if you have personal planets in those two signs, this is going to be, you know, extra potent to you as well. Because that Mars is ruling any personal planets you have in those two signs.
Yeah, and that's a good reminder, because it's in Gemini, Mars will also be looking to Mercury. And it's a good thing to think about, and we'll look at this a little bit in the chart, with just like what, you know, Mars is looking to Mercury for some cues about how to behave, in a sense. So it's also really important to look at the condition of Mercury. which we will do. The last thing I want to add before I open up that chart is just a little reminder that these retrogrades are about perspective. They only happen from our point of view on Earth.
Right.
Mars is not actually moving backwards around the sun compared to how it normally does. It's just our point of view.
Right.
And because Mars is outside of Earth, you can think of it as, you can understand it by thinking about driving a car and passing a cyclist on the road, you know, and as you see the cyclist coming up, you know, you see it, and then you come up to the same level with that cyclist, and that's when it stations, and then you pass. So from your perspective, it looks like the cyclist is going backwards. Well, that is exactly what's happening with Mars, and it happens at certain periods depending on its distance from the sun,
Right.
the zodiac sign the sun is in. But I'll just leave it at that. I just want to remind you, this is about perspective, and that's what's so cool about astrology, is we're looking at working with our own perspectives of mind. So
yes, very good. Thank you, Jenny. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Look at the chart real quick here.
Yeah, let's look at the chart real quick. I think I have to make it so you can open that.
Okay. Thank you. And here we go. This is just so you can get an idea. This is the moment that Mars turns retrograde. 9:25 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, right before we lose daylight savings. But I think yeah, there it is.
There it is, 25 degrees Gemini.
So I think the first thing is, I just mentioned that Mars will be looking to Mercury. And because Mars is in Gemini, Mercury rules Gemini. So Mars is kind of looking over at Mercury going, hey, what do I need to do? And Mercury is, oh, look at that, is in Aries sign of Scorpio. I mean, sorry, Mars is sign of Scorpio.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So they're in what's called mutual reception. So this is a very strong statement about, with Scorpio, doing the deepen work, understanding your emotional triggers, understanding the things that really like are down and deep. You can learn more about that by checking out our 2 videos on Scorpio season and the new moon in Scorpio.
Right.
But this is how this is beginning, with this incredible depth of Scorpio. And then Mars turning retrograde to make a statement about, okay, folks, you need to go in. You need to go within and take a look at what are the things that are driving the way you communicate.
Yeah. Yeah. That's fascinating that they're in mutual reception, Jenny. I hadn't even noticed that. I confess.
Yeah.
Oh, it's so interesting.
Well, technically speaking, they're also in a trine. So there's a real free flow of energy between the deeper stuff and what you want to say. So that's why we focus a lot in our Scorpio season video and the new moon about pausing and just like, hold on before you go saying the thing that you regret that comes from the depths of your frustration. Just take a pause so that you can speak, you know, with a more of a catalytic approach, where you might have an impact, but you're not doing it in such an aggressive way.
Right. So, you know, during the space of time that Mars is retrograde, it makes 2 aspects 3 times each because of the retrograde, right? So I want to point that out. Mars forms a square aspect to Neptune 3 times during the course of this. That to me is a very interesting. Mars and Neptune together kind of bring in an interest. It's sort of like that motion forward that Mars is trying to learn how to move forward. Neptune brings in confusion, you know, in a square aspect. There's a certain amount of confusion in here. You know, you might make mistakes because you don't really understand. You know, you might make mistakes in that conversation you're trying to have because you really don't understand fully what it is you're trying to talk about. You know, so I think part of the message of that Neptune is listen instead of talking, maybe. You know, you're just not quite ready to communicate the thing.
Yeah, and I also see a little bit of a cautionary tale around, you know, feeling frustrated and trying to just numb out, you know, so whatever that is, substances, a religion, you know, that misused, anything that you reach for in a sort of an addictive mind state, just to kind of numb out and to, you know, it's like an anesthetic.
Right, right. You're confused, so you reach for the bottle of booze, or you're confused and you made a mistake. So yeah, you're going to go down a path that's not clear. There's that whole connection with charismatic leaders. You know, don't fall down the rabbit hole. In other words, watch the rabbit hole. Make sure you're very fully conscious before you follow someone down a rabbit hole.
Yeah. And on a positive note, grapple with that conflict that's presented by the Neptune squaring Mars. I mean, I always just go back to we're just one blue little marble spinning around the sun. We're all on the one same round thing.
Right.
And it might be a little like big thinking, like, oh, we all live on one planet together, but I just think there's a practicality to it too. Like it's all one thing. So use that too as a way to think about things.
And that's, that the confusion of Neptune, think about compassion as well here. As you understand your own mistakes that you're making or confusion that you might be in, and really using that as compassion, because we're all on this same little marble spinning around, feeling a little confused as Mars, which we're used to having it blast forward. All of a sudden, it's like the brakes are on. It's like, oh my God, where are we? It might feel safer to reach for the bottle or fall down the rabbit hole, but holding steady and reaching for that level of compassion, reaching into yourself, your deeper intuition with that Neptune, using your imagination to understand or to rewrite the story. That Gemini, the storyteller, and you don't need to reach for the bottle. You could go sit on the meditation cushion or
or I mean, I was also thinking about like a sweat lodge, and doing these like body practices or shamanic practices, to clarify your mind, to clear out the clutter of the mind, to clear. I mean, in yoga, it's like you talk a lot about samskara, which is the attachments that cloud your mind. So it's a clearing away of those, doing practices that clear away that cloudiness, clear away, confusion.
That's awesome. That's great. So that's how to use that. When you notice in the midst of this retrograde, that feeling of confusion or distress, keep that in mind.
Yeah.
So the other aspect that Mars is making 3 times during its retrograde is a beautiful trine to Saturn. So, you might be confused, but you can uplift yourself with some stabilizing energy through that Saturn. Saturn's really allowing you to, open your eyes to the reality. It's also in an air sign, so it's a very intellectual process of understanding and supporting yourself as you do this kind of backwards examination of the story you're telling yourself in that area.
Yeah. And Saturn allows you to like make a schedule, so if you feel like you need education, Saturn is what helps you like be like, oh, I need to look that up, and then I need to sign up for the thing and pay, and then that's going to be on my calendar. So on this date, I'm doing that thing. That's going to help me clarify my mind. So I mean, Saturn is it's awesome that trine is happening at the same time.
Yeah.
Because you're right. It's really an opportunity for a lot of mental stability to make choices like that at a time that's also challenging to mental capacity. So
I love that both of those, they're an interesting combination. The square to Neptune and the trine to Saturn. And those are the only 2 planets that it directly impacts 3 times during the retrograde.
Yeah. And I love that because it shows you a relationship, like this little chart that, Laurie's added these lines. So it shows you these relationships between things. Like things don't happen in isolation. So that's cool. I really like that.
Right.
All right. We ready to move on?
I think we are ready to dive into our personal impacts. And I think we're going to try to keep these relatively simple and direct. So let's open this up. Here you are. Now, if you have Aries rising, where's Mars? It's right there in that 3rd house. as you can
Mhm.
see quite directly. Mars.
Yeah.
That's the
Wow.
energy of Mars, right? So
Yeah.
if you've got Aries rising, what's, one question I would ask very simply, what's the story you've been telling yourself about your ability to be assertive in conversation, your yeah, how are you in communication or in those relationships with siblings or neighbors or those day-to-day connections you make with people? How are those connections, and how do you need to think about your own assertiveness in that realm?
Yeah. Yeah, and that's great. And that brings to mind just the whole, are you talking too much? Are you not talking enough? Are you listening? Are you able to hold up both ends of that dualistic Gemini of talking and listening? Like, are you able to do
Right.
that?
Mhm.
And I imagine with Aries rising, you may tend to sort of charge on in and start, maybe possibly depends on the other things that you have going on in your chart, but you
Right.
might have that tendency to kind of ride in on the horse and start
Yeah. And you've
pontificating.
and
Um,
you've probably since August 20th, you've probably been driving forward with maybe a particular agenda about communicating with certain people, about your ideas of things. But there's always, I think because Mars is spending so much time
mhm,
in Gemini, I think, you know, pick up a book about communication skills.
mhm.
This is a period of time where you can really learn a lot about how you communicate.
Yeah, this would be a great time to look at there's a couple great books about nonviolent communication,
Yeah.
and just really how to work with that. That'd be really, really helpful.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah,
Absolutely. Okay. Are
awesome.
we ready to move on?
I think so.
All right. For those of you with Taurus rising, Mars's full retrograde is happening in the second house. So what's the second house about, Gemini, Jenny, and I was going to call you Gemini. And how are we going to think about Mars moving through that area?
Well, the second house pertains to our resources. So this is both financial resources, but also less tangible inner resources like how you value yourself. And so it really kind of works with the whole breadth of that. So with Mars going through that second house, this is a good time to revisit those topics. What is the story that you've told yourself that
Yeah.
you're not worth very much, that you don't value yourself?
Right.
Or the opposite. What is the story you've told where your ego's taken the front seat and you're super important, you're more important than anyone else in the room? So it's working with those issues.
Yeah.
And with
Yeah.
Mars retrograde, it's working with the inner stuff, for sure, like really looking at
Yeah.
some of that.
Yeah. And
Mhm.
how are you in relationship with money? What is your relationship to your finances? How do you, beat yourself up if you don't have enough? Or what is enough? I mean, there's an awfully lot that you can contemplate here about the story you tell yourself about your value and how it relates to your bank account. What's
Mhm.
the story you've told yourself? And are you being kind to yourself with that story? And yeah, maybe it's time to rewrite that story.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and again, use that idea of being curious,
Yeah.
and sort of be fascinated by this relationship that you have.
Yeah, yeah. I
Um,
find
yeah,
that the relationship between money and self-worth is so fascinating, especially with people who have strong components in that second house. All right.
yeah, and again, like you always have to look at that backdrop of our culture, and our culture overvalues material things and
Right.
money in particular. So
Yeah.
there's that, and then also whoever Taurus rising you are, if you have planets in Gemini, this is going to bring this home a little more, depending what those
Yeah.
planets are.
Yeah. Yeah. Taurus rising loves comfort and beautiful things too. So that's interesting. Okay, let's move on to those of you with Gemini rising. This is going to put this Mars retrograde right in your first house. So this is very personal to you. This is very much about, really, it's time to think about what your story is about how you are perceived, how people respond to you. Are you do you come across with gentle curiosity, or is that Mars really getting in the way here? Listen to your voice. I think, with Mars in Gemini, there's a real need to pay attention to the edge in our voice.
Yeah, I think you're right. I
And
also think, yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
yeah, no, just with Gemini rising, particularly with this Mars retrograde right there, listen to the tone in your voice. Make sure that others are perceiving you the way you think they are.
I was also just going to comment that if this is you, a Gemini rising, this is going to be a really important time to notice any anxiety that's coming up and do something with it. Get yourself, do some of those more inward facing practices. Maybe it's that you need to meditate before you go to bed. Or it depends. I mean, there's different activities you can do, but I think with Mars charging through that first house, it's really activating. And that can bring a lot of excitement and energy and forward movement, but it also can bring really intense anxiety. And it's a really good time to question the personal narrative that you carry as you walk around the world. And I think a key word or phrase is self-development in this time. Like, how do you want to develop? What do you need to look at with that Mars retrograding through your first house?
Right. Yeah. Might be time to rewrite your whole narrative of who I am. That's so interesting. Okay, so we're going to move on now to those of you with Cancer rising. And this is going to place Mars right in the 12th house. So this is, for you, this Mars retrograde period of time is really about digging into the story you tell yourself about your abilities to take action, the stories that you don't, they're under the surface. They're unconsciously told stories. You really need to kind of dig deep to understand.
Yeah. I think too, with Mars going through your 12th house, this might be a good time to write down things that are coming up. Write down your dreams.
Good
write
idea.
down these like things that are hidden away. Because also our personal narratives about who we are and all these things, they're in a weird way, they're hidden from view. Especially we can carry a lot of negativity that we don't even realize that we directed ourselves. It's hard to see. So, I mean, this is a good time to really work on reflecting on that specific piece. And I think writing things down can really help you see things that you can't otherwise. There might be other ways to do this. This might be something you do. And I was thinking about therapy, but I wasn't thinking about traditional therapy. I was thinking more about like sort of a body mind therapy here to see what comes up from those deeper reaches of your unconscious.
Yeah, I love that you brought up writing down your dreams. I think that's a really significant one. With Gemini there in that 12th house, you've got a lot of natural curiosity about what goes on behind the scenes in your own self. And this is a time to really take some action on understanding that.
Yeah. I think it's important too, with Cancer rising, to pay attention to your mental health during this time. I mean, health in general, but mental health. Like, are you doing the things you need to do to release anxious energy? Are you releasing your frustration? Are you putting it somewhere? Because if you're just holding on to it, it's not going to be helpful, especially for your mind. So this is a really good time to think about, those mental health pieces and how do you want to get support around that?
Yeah, and I guess that kind of brought me into where's Mercury in your own chart, and that would give you more information about how to work with that. But that's going off there. It's an interesting placement. I mean, the 12th house is always a little tricky to understand because it is so below the surface or behind the scenes, hidden away there.
So could be a rich time though. Yeah,
it could be a very rich time. And I want to just one more time say, I love the idea of writing down your dreams because I think you'd get a lot of information through your dreams during this retrograde. Okay, so moving on to those of you with Leo rising, this is going to put that Mars retrograde right in your 11th house. So, what's been happening? What's the story that you're telling yourself currently about community? And in thinking about the 11th house community, it's really the community that supports you to your desires. This is not your best friends or your family or your children. This is community of like-minded people. So, what needs to be, what's the conversation? What's the story you're telling yourself? How does it need to be changed?
Yeah, are you able to receive support? Because that support
Right.
might well be there and you just don't even know it's there because you haven't been able to tune into it. It's also a
Right.
really good time to think about
Yeah.
how you communicate in groups,
Yeah.
like whatever that
Yeah.
group is, like even if you're showing up to a party or maybe you're helping staff the polls on voting day or something, and it's thinking about like what is the story you've told yourself about how you participate and recognizing that you can change it.
Huh.
You can look within a bit more and you can step into a new place, into a new role. So,
Right. Oh, I love that. I love thinking about that as, yeah, I mean, Mars. Look at that Mars in that little graphic. It's like Mars with an exclamation point. There's some action in that area, in that community. And I love that you brought up working the polls. I can just imagine that. Yeah, you're kind of holding that curiosity about what could happen, what kind of energies are on the table there, and really thinking about assertiveness, how you work with the conversations you're having with people in that environment, and listening.
yeah.
Listening.
Yeah, that's also the listening piece. Because what's just
Yeah.
interesting when you think about a Leo rising person. I mean, this is a person who usually walks into the room and is noticed, generally speaking. That's that Leo right there showing up first. Everybody sees that first. So
Yeah.
having Mars in your area of groups, I mean, you have to consider that whether you know it or not, you may well be showing up as a leader of sorts when you walk into the room. And so it's looking at some of those things too, like what is your role? How do you interact? Have you done the necessary personal work to show up in that role without being aggressive and domineering? I mean, it's
Right.
it's good questions to ask yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. Look at your role in that community. Are you showing up with a lot of aggression? Is your voice harsh? Or are you showing up with a lot of curiosity and allowing other people to contribute to your thinking and your role in that area? That's
Yeah, I mean, are you a pickleball phenom?
I don't even know where to go with that one, Jenny.
I had to joke about it. It's popping up everywhere. Anyway.
Oh, okay. Okay. Do you want to say more about pickleball?
I was just thinking that a lot of times what you end up doing in groups is sports, especially as an adult, like when I mean, maybe in college or whatever, but move beyond that and you're just looking at ways to stay fit and so on and so forth. You end up joining these little groups and that'd be a very appropriate place to release some of that Mars energy, right? In a way that actually incorporates some play and, that kind of thing, rather than being so deadly serious all the time.
Good point. Good point. Great. Okay. Play pickleball. All right, so we're going to move right on from Leo rising to Virgo rising. If you've got Virgo rising, this Mars retrograde is in your 10th house of career, reputation. So you're going to really be thinking about how you've been moving forward in this area of your life, in your career. How's the path been? What's your story been of how you're moving forward in your career and what needs to change? You need to slow down and go back and really examine how you're using your energy in your career.
Mhm.
What are you doing that you hate doing? Maybe it's time to stop.
Yeah, or delegate, right? There's always that idea, like you gotta, especially if you're working a business by yourself. It's like
Yeah.
you've got to like figure out what you can hand off.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is a really good time to think about how your voice gets out there too, through your work,
Yeah.
whether you're sitting at a desk and you're just emailing with coworkers or whether you're in charge of a big corporation or something. Like,
Yeah.
what are the things that you need to look at with how you're communicating in that way? Because it's showing up in a very public sphere.
Yeah.
So if you're coming across as aggressive, like it's gonna show up, but if you've done the work of introspecting somewhat and making sure you're listening to other people, then you're going to be in a better shape to I don't know, evolve than to fix things that you're not doing well, you know?
Yeah.
So
Absolutely. What's the story you're telling yourself and what needs to change in that story?
mhm.
Okay.
Enjoy your pause.
Enjoy your pause. Right. Absolutely. Okay. So now, if you have Libra rising, this Mars retrograde is happening in your ninth house. That's such an interesting house. The ninth house with Gemini. So those of you with Libra rising always have Gemini in this house. And right now, Mars is really requiring you to re-examine how you're using your mental processes, the storyline about what your worldview is. The ninth house is really, it's about where we expand our thinking,
Yeah.
how we understand the greater world.
Yeah, and I think that those of you with Gemini in your ninth house, this Libra rising, there might possibly be a tendency to keep things kind of quick and shallow. Like, oh, I got it, I know, and not really
Right.
dig a bit deeper and examine your own viewpoints, and to realize that
Yeah.
you could potentially have some very dualistic thinking where it's like me versus the world,
Right.
and
Right.
really splitting complexity into black and white and just trying to make things very black and white, and that's not really how the world is. And so
Right.
I think that this Mars retrograde gives you an opportunity to kind of dig into that
Yeah.
and to be
Yeah.
curious about what duality is and when is it useful, and then when do you need to go deeper. And it's useful when you're thinking about, well, I'm talking, now I'm listening, that kind of duality. But once you start labeling people or putting them in boxes and trying to keep it really black and white, it just doesn't work anymore, because
Yeah.
people are a lot more complex than that. So this gives you an opportunity to kind of tangle with a little bit more of like, what complexity, am I going deep enough in this area, or do I just keep it surface?
Right.
So
Yeah. As I hold this particular worldview, it's time to stop and listen and allow that perspective to shift.
yeah, and
You
tap the
know,
thing you're talking about, curiosity, right?
yeah. Yeah. But think about the way you view the culture. When we talk about worldview, there's so much that makes that up. The
Mhm.
ninth house, on a simple level, I think worldview. But what's that made up of? It's made up of our education, our religion, our politics, all those things, our understanding of culture. It's a huge piece. And Gemini, like you said, it wants to keep things simple. And there's no
Yeah,
simplicity
yeah,
when it comes to this house. So this Mars retrograde is really encouraging you to listen to other people's perspectives on all of those things.
yeah,
And, whatever makes that up in your mind, to
yeah.
listen to other people and allow those other voices to shift the way you see things.
Hmm. I was thinking one of those, based on the things you're saying, Lori, I was thinking it's kind of like the delineation between fact or fiction. Is this a fact or is this fiction? And the reality is that this house is saying to you, even in a fiction book, there's a lot of universal truths, so it kind of blurs that line. It's not as simple as
Ah,
fact or fiction,
ah,
and there's a little bit of both to each other.
ah.
There's truth in fiction, and there's ways that you can very easily use facts in an aggressive way that is not constructive. So that's just what you made me think of when you're thinking about
Huh.
this like truth seeking component of the ninth house. So
That's
yeah.
interesting. Yeah. All
Study
right.
up.
That you've got some work to do, Libra rising. All right. So now we're going to move on to those of you with Scorpio rising. This is going to put that Mars retrograde right into your eighth house. Wow. That's particularly interesting because Mars rules Scorpio. So it's very, very strong for you. And the eighth house is such an area of depth and intensity, and such an area where we can clash with other people.
Yeah.
So you're going to really want to pay attention to this. Those of you with Scorpio rising, the tendency to have your own, opinions that can push against other people's beliefs is going to really, you're going to want to pay attention.
Yeah. That's interesting. I think you're just bringing to mind. I mean, there's a lot about perspective of the eighth house of other people's values, of having to kind of look at that. Because I think with Scorpio rising, like you're naturally on this kind of intense trajectory where everything has to be deep and intense. And there's a big thing around privacy and introspection. And yet on your eighth house, which is one of the deepest places, you have this like Gemini, which just kind of wants to skip on over and
Right.
like just do it kind of quickly. And it's a sort of an irony to the Scorpio
Yes.
rising where perhaps you're making assumptions in that quick skip over of other people's values and baggage. And that now might be a time to go, well, hold on. What if I applied my deep introspective Scorpio eyesight to other people's things that they're going on and really listened
Right.
and tuned in and used the Mars in that way and kind of slowed down instead of just making these assumptions.
That's
But
it's really interesting how you said that. And oh, I can't quite grasp where my brain wanted to go with that. But yeah, that tendency with Scorpio rising, how deep you are, right? Like your personal depth is very clear to you. But with Gemini on that line, other people's depth isn't necessarily that clear to you, right?
Mhm.
And
Yeah,
that's what Mars here in this retrograde is really showing you,
yeah,
or allowing you to see that that there is an incredible depth in other people that you need to pay attention to.
yeah. Yeah, so this is more about what is
It's
your
interesting.
narrative about other people's stuff,
Right,
It's more that. And this can
right,
be, this can be your intimate partners, and it also might be just the person you bump into the street and have some sort of political debate with, and you're
right,
trying to figure out how to communicate without being,
right,
because you could just kind of slam them because you're just in this shallow space and Mars is there. So, so
right, right.
it's it's
But
not activate that
listening and
introspection.
yeah, listening and understanding
Mm,
where other people are at with this stuff. Yeah, get curious about other people
mm,
and their depth.
mhm.
I love that. That's so interesting. Okay, now we're going to move on to those of you with Sagittarius rising. If you've got Sagittarius rising, this is falling in your seventh house. And this is probably going to play out in your intimate partnership or maybe a business partner, some one on one equal partnership is where this is going to play out.
Mhm.
You're going to have to listen to your partner very carefully,
Whether you want to or not.
whether you want to or not.
Yeah. Yeah, because that Sagittarius rising, it's so expansive. And then you get to the Gemini in the seventh house, and it maybe wants things to be a bit simple with the relationship at home, like
Yeah.
just want it to be, it's just, it works. It's the two of us together, or what, depending what your paradigm is. And I think with Mars, there's causing you to question, like, hold on, is there something more we can have to this connection? I mean, I can't help but think about
Yeah.
Mars to doing, to do with sex, right? Like your
Right.
intimate connection with that partner. So this is giving an opportunity to really look at that. And maybe you've fallen into some kind of, I don't know, like maybe not superficial, but just less deep ways of being with that person who's your partner. Um,
Right.
and
Right.
maybe it's time to kind of let's look a little deeper and see what's missing and find some honesty and
Yeah.
communication with the partner.
Yeah, really getting curious again with Gemini, but getting curious about how you can, at this period of time, during this period of time, you can rewrite that story of your relationship.
Mm-hmm.
You can really, through listening, communicating, being curious, and really hearing that other person, you can really rewrite that story right now. Um,
Yeah.
and and that's a huge value. That's
Yeah.
that's a powerful place
Mm.
to be. So if you've got Sagittarius rising, really engage in some work with your partner.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of that thing. Like, have you ever had that experience where you like go to a little social gathering with your partner and somebody asks them a question and you find out this story you had never heard about from your partner? And you're like, wait, I thought I knew you. What? Like, this happened? It kind of reminds
Right.
me of that. Like, revealing those kind of little hidden, fun little hidden stories about your partner that can kind of reinvigorate your relationship where you're like,
Right.
oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, that's great. So, Sagittarius rising, have fun. Enjoy this one. This is really a nice placement, I think. Okay, now we're moving on to those of you with Capricorn rising, and this places Mars in your 6th house, which is the area of day-to-day routines that support your health, that support your functioning in the world. What's Mars there going to be like?
Ooh, I just think this is a
Hmm.
really important time, Capricorn Rising, to get to grips with any way that your mental state isn't stable.
Hmm.
Noticing, like, I
Hmm.
keep thinking about anxiety because Gemini and like
Hmm.
flitting around, it's that
Yeah.
anxious mental energy. So I think this is a really important time to make sure that your healthcare things that you do, your fitness, your eating, those things are supporting you, calming, supporting you, like settling down and like making sure that you're finding a way to kind of offload some of that mental energy in a healthy way. The duality of Gemini always makes me think of something like playing squash with somebody or tennis, something where there's two of you and you're kind of going back and forth, as your preventative health. And maybe you're also talking about the things that are aggravating you.
Yeah.
So you're also blowing off some mental steam. So it's hopefully a sport where you can have conversation
Yeah.
while you're doing the thing. I mean, that's kind of what to me is the perfect symbol of what you
Huh.
might want to work with.
That's
Capricorn Rising.
interesting. Yeah, I'm thinking just in terms of the story you tell yourself about your health. This is a time when you can rewrite that story. What do you need to do to if you are in a place where your health is compromised, this is a really powerful time for you to really consider what it is you need, what kind of changes you need to make in your routine. Yeah, maybe you need to take up one of these sports or pickleball. I don't even know what pickleball is, but
I
I
know.
love the word. So anyway,
Yeah. I think the
yeah,
flip side too is also making sure, because I have a couple people in mind that I just thought of, like also making sure you're not engaging in like sort of bashing yourself with your exercise, like, oh, I need to exercise every single day, or I'm just not going to be, I'm not
right,
worth anything, those kinds of mentalities. You really, really don't want that.
right.
Like, so it's also looking at that. Are you overdoing, and
Yes,
it might be the case with Mars going there that you're highlighting, ooh,
absolutely.
like there's too much
Well,
yang energy here, right?
yeah, I mean, I can imagine when Mars moved in there in August, like, oh, I'm going to take on this new sport or this new, yeah, I'm going to run every single day. And then as it slows down toward the station retrograde, all of a sudden you twist your ankle and you have to rewrite the story. Those kind of things could play a part here. Really
Yeah.
learning a new way to use Mars in that area.
Yeah.
Get curious.
Yeah.
Right,
Great.
because those, that 6th house, those routines, they're not all about sports or activity necessarily. They're also dietary and
Yeah. And you said it in the beginning, health. These are the things you do to keep your health. So
right.
that should be the main idea,
Yeah,
is that you're paying attention to your physical health.
right, right. Okay. Now that we've finished that, let's move on to those of you with Aquarius rising. This puts Mars in your 5th house. Okay, Mars in the 5th house. 5th house is really about how we give of ourselves most directly and clearly. You can think of the 5th house as children, creativity, um, love affairs, sex partners, just that playful kind of energy that we bring to those areas. With Mars here, what is it? You've been bringing this direct Martian kind of energy. You've been moving forward here, but then there's something that needs to be rewritten in this story.
Yeah, I like how you keep bringing up, Lori, the whole idea of the narrative and the story you've been telling yourself. And so this is what is the story you've been telling yourself about how you can love other people?
Yeah,
And it's
exactly.
that playful, fun, generous type of love where it's not tied, there's no strings attached,
Right,
it's just
right.
being in the moment. And it's really important for those of you with Aquarius rising that, this is really important for your mind, that you have a chance to just play, and be in the curious space with your mental capacity. I mean, your intellect. Let your intellect kind of banter and like play back and forth between ideas, and not feel like it has to be tied to one particular thing. And I kind of think of that
Right.
in this time period.
I think Mars doing the retrograde in the fifth house could just, you could create so much fun in your life
Mm,
if you allow yourself to change the story. If you
mm,
think it has to be a certain way and you're pushing forward and, you've got this creative project and you've already got this set idea of exactly how it's going to be, you're going to fall into a lot of frustration with the retrograde. But if you can allow yourself to be curious about, oh, well, it's not working in that direction, but let's tweak it in this direction, you could have a lot of fun discovering new ways to do it. And not only with creative projects, but, you can think about your sexuality there too, how you
mm,
play with sexual energies with a partner,
mm.
or on a totally different level, how, your relationship to how you love in general, how you
Yeah.
love your children. If you think it has to be a certain way, but all of a sudden that child is not fitting the picture that you thought it was supposed to,
Mm,
change your ideas, change that narrative, change the storyline here of how this has to be. I
mm.
like this. I like the fifth house as a placement for this
Yeah.
Mars retrograde. I really like it.
Yeah, I think I do too. And you reminded me, one of the things that I might be helpful too is just thinking about your relationship to risk.
Oh,
Like, are
yeah.
you risk averse? Do you take too
Yeah.
many risks? And just kind of looking at that and then asking yourself, like, what kind of risk do you want to take? Like, is this a risk like, ooh, I wrote something and I'm going to show some people what I wrote or post it or something like that? Or, I mean, that might, or to someone else, it might be jumping out of an airplane, right? So this is a good time to assess your relationship to risk and
Yeah.
ask yourself, where might you want to take more risk, and where are you kind of like, I'm not taking that kind of risk anymore, and just evaluating that.
Right. Right. Yeah. Evaluating how you use that energy. That's beautiful. I love that. Okay, Aquarius rising, enjoy this retrograde. Now we're going to move on to those of you with Pisces rising. So with Pisces rising, this Mars retrograde is happening in the fourth house of home and family. How do you think that might play out, Jenny?
Oh, geez. I think there's so much in our family lives, if you're using the kind of family definition of the fourth house. So I think this is a really good time to look at your narrative around whatever your role is in the family,
Yeah.
whatever you think you're supposed to think and do for your family. I think this is a good time to look at that. And you might surprise yourself and find out that there's much more to your role, or you can release some parts of it, or maybe it's time to, if you're a parent, like maybe it's time to kind of think about the different roles of you and what other people are helping you raise your children, other parents or
Mm,
other people who are involved. um, this also could be some way that you're looking at, maybe have some narrative about where you come from, your lineage. Oh, my family was this, my family was that, and
right.
it's this way, and I'm
Right.
stuck because that's how they all are. Not so. This is a great time to look at that. And perhaps Mars has a real
Huh.
severing ability. So if you do some contemplation when it goes back direct, you may be able to sever some of the story that isn't working for you, that you want to release yourself from, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Hmm.
Boundaries, setting boundaries. Yeah,
Hmm.
it really is. Think about what your story is around your home and family, and think about how you've been holding it, how it's kind of, I think with Mars moving in here, maybe over these last months since Mars went into Gemini, you've been actively developing some way of being with your family, or it could be about your home itself. Maybe you've been
Yeah.
putting a new roof on your house, and all of a sudden something happens and you have to rethink how that process is going to go forward. It might not be what you thought it was going to be, whether it be your relationships with your family members or your relationships to the home itself. Rethinking, rewriting your own narrative of your home and family is going to be really important to do.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
Yeah. Good.
All right.
All right.
Anything else you want to say about that placement?
I don't think so. I think we covered it pretty
Okay.
well.
All right. Well, enjoy that. I hope your roof project is going well, Pisces Rising. All right. Stop share. Now, if anyone else is still with us, thank you for being here. And we'll be back with more videos soon.
Sounds good. Thank you very much. Thank you, Laurie.
Thanks, Jenny. Bye-bye.
Bye.